McCarthy Insurance Group, serving the community for over 70 years. For home, farm, motor, life, health and business insurance, log on to mig.ie or free phone 1800 50 11 11. Probably your best call in 2024. Charles McCarthy Insurance is trading as McCarthy Insurance Group, is regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland.
Now, real people, real opinions. Nighttime Talk with Niall Boylan.
Ireland's classic hits radio.
I want to talk to Jay Belsky. And Jay is the Professor of Human Development at the University of California. He is the author of more than 500 scholarly articles and chapters. His most recent, The Origins of You, How Childhood Shapes Later Life, published by Harvard University Press. His areas of special expertise include the effects of daycare, parent-child relationships, the transition to parenthood. This is going to be interesting, actually, after what I was talking about earlier on, where I was born. But anyway, the evolutionary basis of parent and child functioning, and many other areas. Jay is here to talk to us all about his knowledge on child development, but specifically when it comes to motherhood, and why putting your children in a creche may not always be the best option, even though you may not have other options. I have Jay on the line with us. Jay, good evening to you.
Hello.
Jay, nice to talk to you. Jay, let's go straight to the brunt of this and, talk about putting children in creche for the formative years of their lives. Do you believe it's damaging?
Well, I'm hesitant I don't embrace the notion of damaging. To me, that's too vague and potentially, dangerous and catastrophic. I think there is evidence that under certain I think there's evidence, let me put it this way, that at least in my own country, and there's evidence of this at least in the UK, I don't know about in Ireland, that what has become normative in America carries risks. What do I mean by normative in America? I mean, when children begin care in the first year of life, which continues on a full or near full-time basis, 20, 30 or more hours a week, until they start school, at least in America, about the age of 5, there's evidence not only that these children end up being more aggressive and disobedient, somewhat. Let's not catastrophize here. In the early years, before they start school and during their schooling years, and by adolescence, they become more impulsive and risk-taking, drugs, sex, and rock and roll, so to speak. And there's even some evidence that they have more contact with the police. Now, I want to make it clear here that it'd be a mistake to conclude that each and every single child who is exposed to the experiences that I've just mentioned will develop this way. Children vary in the degree to which they're affected by all sorts of things. But
you do believe there's a pattern there, yes. You do believe there's a pattern in that.
Yes, there is a pattern. It's been detected repeatedly. There are many who claim otherwise. And the most important claim otherwise is that, to quote, Bill Clinton's, or to take advantage of Bill Clinton's presidential campaign terminology, it's quality stupid. The argument has been that as long as caregivers are responsive, attentive, and stimulating, then quantity of care, the amount of care you have starting in the first year through the fourth year, doesn't matter. Well, the only study that's ever looked at this in any detail or even been positioned to look at this was one I was involved in the United States. And what became crystal clear was that this wasn't a matter of the quality of care. In other words, one of the mistakes people often make when discussing the effects of daycare is to presume that the only thing that matters is the quality of care, the attentive responsiveness and training of caregivers. Mm-hmm. But like many other things in life, quantity of care, hours, weeks, months, and years also matter. And what's really interesting is that while the quality of care seems to matter in terms of cognitive and language development, it's the quantity of care that seems to matter when it comes to behavioral and psychological development.
That's so interesting to hear that. And I know there are many people listening tonight that say, well, look, I've no choice. We both have careers. We have to pay a mortgage. We'd love to be there for the formative years of a child's life, or one of us, because all a child ever requires is attention and love. But we can't do that. So how is there a way of making up for that? So if you're putting your child in a creche, for 5 hours a day, from 9 o'clock in the morning until whatever time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and picking them up again after work, is there a way of making up for that? Can you, if you give extra time to that child or bring them places or do things with them more, can you make up for that?
Yeah, let me first say, my heart goes out to all those parents who find themselves in this situation. In fact, what is striking and disturbing is that whether you do the surveys in the United States or in the UK, and my guess in Ireland as well, I don't know about those surveys, what parents clearly express is the desire to be home with their babies in the first year or two of life. There are some people chasing their careers who, from 5 minutes after delivery, or certainly in the first 3 months of life, are ready, willing, and desirous of having somebody else care for their children. Mm-hmm. And that's perfectly fine. What we don't appreciate is too much in so much of the progressive rhetoric, and I consider myself progressive, by the way, is that that's the exception, not the rule. Most parents want to be home, want one of the parents to be home with their baby. Now, to come back to your question specifically, about is there something parents can do? Yes, there is. Children grow up in multiple environments. We're talking about the creche or daycare centers on the one hand. We'll be talking about schools when they get older and neighborhoods and peer groups. And of course, family matters. And I would go so far as to say, and I think the evidence bears me out, family matters more than childcare. So think of it this way, being attentive, responsive, and available to your children, spending time with them, nurturing them, may have upside gains or likely to have upside gains that counter to a degree the downside costs. Now, one of the challenges here is that many parents who spend the days away from their children kind of want to be overly caring and friendly with them. So let's imagine we have a child who's being recalcitrant, stubborn, disobedient as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. And because the modern parent wants to be the child's friend, they're not consistent in stopping the child from doing that and distinguishing the fact that I don't like the behavior, but I love the person. And so a challenge for parents is how do we, remain available and responsible, even when we're feeling, so to speak, perhaps guilty about being away from the child so often.
Yeah. And where does discipline, sorry for interrupting, but you talked about, this kind of modern way of parent of being the child's friend. And I'm noticing that more and more, that, parents nowadays seem to want to be best pals with the child rather than being a parent or a guardian. Has that had an effect on the way children are being raised? Now, I'm not saying we should go back to the dark days where, parents would slap children constantly all the time and discipline them. Although some people like me would say it didn't do me any harm, and my mother would take her slipper off and scalp me across the back of the bottom. But is there a way of disciplining a child, or is discipline as a rule just a bad thing?
Well, no, again, what do we mean when we say discipline? There is harsh discipline, there's physical discipline, there's hitting, spanking, humiliating, okay? But there's also, most importantly, explaining rules, giving a timeout that's not too long, it's developmentally and age appropriate. I remember when my children were little and they were misbehaving and we had a stairway in the house, we would say, go sit on the stairs. And that didn't cut them off from people, but they couldn't move around freely at that point. Now, it didn't keep them on the stairs for an hour, a week, a month. In fact, the littler they were, the less time they spent there. Yeah. And eventually the children realized that I'd rather be out doing what I want to do than stuck here in this boring place, even if it's only for 3 minutes. Yeah. If you're dealing with, an 18-month-old or especially a 2-year-old kind of thing. Yeah. So I think there's no, if you're not prepared to hold your children accountable, the moral of the story is, for most children, and again, there's variation here in responsiveness, being warm and demanding is a good combination. You know, you've got to imagine having a teacher who's encouraging but holds you accountable. That is developmentally, on average, a much better strategy than just being warm and caring and wanting to avoid making a child feel, uncomfortable.
I also looked up statistics. There's a slight delay between the two of us. That's why it sounds like I'm interrupting you every now and again. I do apologise. But I also saw statistics recently from the United States in relation to broken homes, where a mother and father are separated or divorced or a single parent family. And the statistics were quite startling that, young people or children who grow up in broken homes are more likely to end up in jail. They're more likely to be murderers. They're more likely to be rapists. They're more likely to commit crimes. I mean, why is that? Why is it that when a child comes from a broken home, when they're still getting the love from one parent maybe and they have access to the second parent on a Saturday or whatever it happens to be, why do they always, well, not always, but why they have more propensity to end up in crime?
Well, okay, I think the first thing we have to say is that especially the, quote, outcomes, the criminological outcomes that you've described, even for children growing up in divorced, broken homes, is the exception, not the rule. Now, what may be more likely than that is they might be more likely to do many non-normative things, like maybe they'll get suspended from school, maybe they'll get in constant conflicts or fights with their so-called friends and peer group. Maybe they'll be less inclined to do their homework. Now, exactly why that might be the case is unlikely to be one thing. I mean, if your mother is, attentive and caring and she has, responsibility for you, the question is, how often can she be around? If she's working the night shift or if she's working 3 jobs, all of a sudden we have a lack of supervision. Then there's the case of what about what I will call the secondary parent who may be minimally involved and who may be abusive, humiliating of the children. Or worse yet, perhaps, I wouldn't say worse yet, or simply not involved. I mean, those things send a message to children that don't make them feel secure and cared for. So it may be, the truth is that relationship breakups are not random. You're more likely to get a relationship breakup when one of the parents, and this isn't true of all breakups, of course, but when one of the parents has their own personal difficulties, they have trouble controlling their temper, they have trouble with too much drinking, they have trouble, or they may just not be able to produce enough income to provide safety and security for their family. These are the kinds of people who are more at risk of ending up in broken relationships. Now, obviously, there are a whole other set of people who end up in broken relationships because they're perfectly mentally healthy, they're doing fine, but they've fallen out of love with each other. I mean, that's a whole different cup of tea.
Okay, something I was talking about earlier on as well on the show was at what age do we start to form our adulthood? In other words, we had a big issue here in this country, I'm not too sure you're familiar with it, called the mother and baby homes. And this was going back 30, 40 years ago, where a lot of children were born in orphanages, sold off to Americans, by the way, and Irish people by the Catholic Church and the nuns. And those children wouldn't have had a bond with a parent because the parent would have been taken out, the mother would have been, kicked out of the mother and baby home as soon as the baby was born, and the baby could have been there for 6 months to a year waiting for somebody to take that baby or adopt that baby. Now, the argument at the moment over here is in relation to compensation for those children, redress as they call it, for those children, that psychologists are saying, well, really, if you're only there for 6 months, it wouldn't have had a profound effect on your life. But if you're there for more than 6 months in this particular orphanage, well, you might have had a profound effect on your life because you would have had a parent to have bonding. But does that first 6 months, a mother staying at home or a father staying at home with that child or that first year, does that have an effect on a child's life?
Well, there is some evidence, and Sir Michael Rudder, who's since deceased, the famous child psychiatrist in London, has written wrote a lot about this. And there is some evidence that the first 6 months are easier to get quote, over if something bad has happened than than thereafter. I do think that there is a heightened, and I think most of my colleagues would as well, is a heightened sensitivity to life in the first year and the second year and the third year than there is later on, which is not to say that what goes on later on doesn't matter, but there's a special sensitivity. And the other issue here is, it may not even be that these babies we're talking about now were not bonded to their mothers. It was that they weren't bonded to anybody. Mm-hmm. What were these institutions like? And as we know from the Romanian experience during the communist era, which has been well studied now, is that those institutions or orphanages were disastrous. Now, even some kids came out of there doing fine, but there were a lot of liabilities that were incurred in many children. So I think in that sense, while on average, generally, nobody cares as much for a child as its parents, there are many caregivers out there in a good institution, which is well funded, and the caregivers are well trained, then children can bond to those caregivers. And that can be as, quote, psychologically nutritious, so to speak, as being bonded to your blood mother. Mm-hmm. Now, the advantage of blood mother is that she's going to stick around. And the problem with institutional caregivers is you're basically going to move on. But if you move on to a home with somebody devoted to you, then, that's an advantage. And more often than not, it will compensate for the disadvantage, let's say, that you've had previously, but not, always.
And in relation to, how I often talk about nature and not nurture, or nurture, not nature. I mean, are we what we are sometimes by design? In other words, you will see a set of parents, they will have 3 children. 2 of those children won't have any problems. They'll go through schooling, they'll go through college, they won't get into trouble. But one of those children will get suspended, will end up in fights, may end up in trouble with the law at some point in their life, will drop out of college. What is the reason for that? What I'm trying to say is, are some people just born differently than others? I mean, that we turn out how we're born.
I think there's no doubt about that. In fact, much of my more recent work has been about something I called differential susceptibility, which is the fact that children vary in how much and to what degree they are affected by their experience and exposures. So you could have 2 children whose mothers or fathers treat them exactly the same, and good, bad, or indifferent. One of them is greatly influenced by them, and the other, it's water off a duck's back. That's a kid who I talk about as a fixed strategist. He's what some people call, well, I won't go there. But in other words, yes, and you have to think about this from an evolutionary standpoint. Imagine if every kid you had was exactly the same rubber stamp. Now, if tomorrow, the future, turned out to be just like today, how they're being cared for, then they'd all be well prepared for that future. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, the future's uncertain. And so nature has actually acted, I believe, like a good financial analyst. That is, we diversify our progeny. Our sibling, if we have 3 kids, those kids only share 50% of their genes with each other. So they're going to be somewhat alike, but not entirely alike. And that way, one could imagine, so take this, quote, bad child. Now imagine the dark ages. Now imagine living in a world where you screw others before they screw you. You have to hit first and ask questions later. That others can't be trusted. Mm-hmm. Well, this bad sort of child is one who's probably well fixed to grow up in that world.
Yeah.
And that's why we have some children. I don't think there are many of them who are probably, just bad sorts. And we know there are stories of children who grow up in perfectly fine, supportive, secure homes who turn out this way. Thank God there aren't many of them.
Yeah.
But my guess is this is nature's way of recognizing that tomorrow's uncertain. Nobody knows what the game is going to be. So if we have children who differ in their traits, one's friendly, one's not, one's susceptible and shaped by the parenting they get, one's not, well, then we're kind of covering our bases.
Just finally, because unfortunately I'd love to talk to you all night. It's a great conversation. But in relation to the modern world we live in and technology and smartphones and iPads and all sorts of things that children... I see babies swiping phones now to see photographs. I mean, they can do it before they can actually talk. Do you think technology nowadays is shaping children? And is that a negative thing, or is it a positive thing and something we should just accept and embrace? Or do you believe it's a very negative thing in the way children are being raised now?
Well, as a 71-year-old, I've come to appreciate the fact that whatever we're bemoaning today, there was something we were bemoaning yesterday. It was television. It was cars.
It was Elvis Presley.
It was chewing gum. So, and I think that these technologies, are good, bad, and indifferent. It depends on how they're used. I mean, if somebody's sitting with you, reading a book on an iPad and talking to you about it, that's a wonderful invention. If instead, you're chased away into your room or into a corner and say, here, take this, I'm too busy, and now all you've got to do is be on the iPad, that's a completely different story. If you're a kid who has a phone and your parents have blocked certain things, that's a different story than if you're a young kid and you can access everything under the sun. So I think it's not just the technology, it's how the technology is used by the child and the extent of supervision the child gets with it.
Okay, so it's us parents who have to educate ourselves on how we introduce that technology to the children.
Yeah, it's like everything else, I mean, most things have to do with not what's delivered, but how they're delivered. And what can be great can also be terrible.
Now, real people, real opinions. Nighttime Talk with Niall Boylan.
Ireland's classic hits radio.